My friends, many of us imagine that if God were to visit our homes, it would be with trumpet blasts, blazing glory, and a shining host of angels at his side. We think of thunder rolling over the rooftops and light pouring into every window. Yet, if Scripture and experience teach us anything, it is that God rarely announces himself with fanfare. More often, he slips quietly into the ordinary moments of our lives, so ordinary that unless we are watchful, we may not even notice his presence. If God were to visit your home, would you recognize him, not merely as an idea, but as a living presence shaping the very air you breathe, the words you speak, and the silence that lingers afterward? There are signs, subtle but unmistakable, that tell us when the eternal has drawn near, and today I want to share 7 of them. The first sign is an unsettling peace. You might imagine peace as soft, gentle, and easily accepted. Yet the peace that comes from above often unsettles before it comforts. It silences the noise within, even when the world outside is chaotic. This peace does not explain itself. It simply is, standing like a guardian at your door. When arguments die away in your family, when anger softens into understanding, when restlessness gives way to stillness, it may be that God has quietly stepped across the threshold. The second sign is conviction. Not the shallow guilt we feel when caught in error, but the deep awareness that our hearts are not what they ought to be. Conviction is uncomfortable, like a mirror suddenly showing us stains we never saw before. It is not cruelty. It is kindness, for only when we see what is broken can we seek the one who mends. When you find your conscience awakened in the quiet of the night, when you sense the weight of truth pressing upon your thoughts, it is not condemnation, but the voice of a visitor who desires to cleanse and restore. The third sign is an unexpected hunger for goodness. Perhaps you once tolerated cruelty in your speech, indifference in your choices, or selfishness in your actions. But when the holy guest draws near, a new appetite stirs. You long for what is pure, noble, and just, not because it flatters your pride, but because it reflects a beauty greater than yourself. Suddenly, dishonest gain tastes bitter. Lies burn on the tongue. Kindness, once considered weakness, becomes strength. This hunger is no natural impulse. It is planted by the divine hand that prepares a feast for your soul. The fourth sign is a heightened awareness of eternity. Most of the time we busy ourselves with trivialities, schedules, accounts, and entertainments that vanish like smoke. But when God visits, time feels different. The smallest moment becomes charged with infinite weight. A child's laughter, a whispered prayer, the breaking of bread, all these ordinary things seem to shine with eternal significance. If you begin to sense that the walls of your home are thinner than you thought, as if eternity itself is pressing through them, then it is no illusion. It is a reminder that your house is not only a dwelling for flesh and blood, but a temple for the living spirit. The fifth sign is reconciliation. Where God walks, divisions stumble. Long-held grudges lose their power. The desire for revenge weakens, replaced by a longing for forgiveness. This is not to say that every wound heals overnight, but that the hardness of heart begins to crack. When God visits a home, estranged siblings find themselves reaching for one another. Parents and children dare to speak words long withheld, and friendships once thought dead begin to stir again. Reconciliation is a work too great for human strength alone. It is the unmistakable fingerprint of the divine. The sixth sign is generosity. A household touched by God becomes less a fortress of self-preservation and more a fountain of blessing. Suddenly, what was once guarded, time, money, energy, is shared freely. Hospitality becomes natural. Strangers find a welcome. The needs of the poor are no longer burdens but opportunities. When love compels you to open your hands rather than close your fists, you can be sure the true master of the house is present, guiding your heart toward his own. The seventh sign is joy in suffering. Perhaps the most perplexing of all signs, yet it is the strongest proof that God has drawn near. When troubles strike, a lost job, an illness, a betrayal, the natural response is despair. But when heaven visits a home, suffering, though painful, does not extinguish hope. Instead, it produces a strange joy, not in the suffering itself, but in the nearness of the one who shares it with you. Tears may fall, but they do not drown. Wounds may ache, but they do not define. In this joy, quiet yet unshakable, you recognize the presence of the guest who himself bore the cross, and now transforms our pain into glory. These 7 signs are not illusions, nor are they the product of wishful thinking. They are the marks of a divine visitation, as real and as close as the breath in your lungs. The question is not whether God can visit your home. He already seeks to do so. The question is, will you open the door? God's presence is often revealed in quiet, subtle signs rather than dramatic displays. When people imagine God's presence, they often expect it to arrive with a kind of overwhelming spectacle. They picture blazing skies, angelic choirs, or some undeniable, earth-shaking event that leaves no room for doubt. But the truth is far more subtle, far quieter, and in some ways, far more demanding of our attention. For when the eternal enters the world of the ordinary, he rarely chooses to make himself obvious to human eyes. Instead, his presence slips into the quiet moments, into the silences between words, into the interruptions that alter the direction of a day, and it requires us to become attentive to a different way of seeing. To understand the nature of God's visitation, one must first recognize that he does not operate according to human standards of recognition. The divine does not compete for spectacle, nor does it insist on thunder when a whisper will suffice. When God draws near, he often cloaks himself in the very fabric of the ordinary, so that it is only the discerning heart that notices. Imagine a household at night, where family members go about their ordinary routines. A child whispers a prayer before bed, not eloquent, not rehearsed, but honest. In that moment, though nothing outward seems extraordinary, heaven has leaned close to listen. A quiet reconciliation between 2 people who have not spoken kindly in weeks carries within it the breath of eternity, though no one else may notice. The sacred does not always make its presence known in dazzling lights, but in the small, hidden gestures that ripple with eternal weight. When God visits, it is rarely to overwhelm our senses but to awaken them, so that we might see what has been there all along. This subtlety can be unsettling, for human beings prefer certainty, and certainty often masquerades as loudness. We want a divine presence that cannot be ignored, that forces us into recognition without any effort of discernment on our part. But God respects human freedom. He chooses to make his presence known in such a way that those who long for him will find him, and those who prefer blindness may pass him by unnoticed. In this, he tests our vision, asking whether we will remain trapped in the expectation of grandeur, or whether we will train our eyes and hearts to recognize the sacred woven into the ordinary fabric of life. One of the most telling signs of divine presence is what might be called an unsettling peace, not the shallow calm that comes from avoidance or distraction, but a deeper stillness that descends even when outward circumstances are unchanged. Imagine a household full of conflict, where voices have been raised and tempers have flared. Suddenly, an inexplicable quiet settles in, not because problems have been solved, but because something larger has entered the room. That peace is not the product of human willpower. It is a visitation. It is the holy stepping across the threshold without demanding recognition. It does not come as a storm, but as a stillness that invites you to notice. Another sign of such presence lies in the quiet conviction that arises unbidden. In the ordinary flow of a day, a thought pierces the heart. Words spoken in haste that caused harm, choices made in selfishness that left wounds, patterns of living that have strayed from what is good. No human hand pressed this awareness upon you. It arrived silently, almost imperceptibly, yet it cannot be ignored. This conviction is not condemnation, but an invitation. It is the whisper of the divine pointing out what is broken not to shame, but to mend. And in this, too, the presence of God is revealed, not in thunderbolts or fiery visions, but in the gentle turning of a heart toward what is true. Such subtlety demands that we live with attentiveness. It asks of us a posture of watchfulness that refuses to dismiss the ordinary as trivial. The daily routines of life, the conversations over meals, the silent moments when the mind drifts, these are the places where the eternal waits to be noticed. One might think of it as a kind of holy camouflage, where God hides himself in the very things we are most likely to overlook. And so the challenge is not to demand that he shout louder, but to train ourselves to listen more closely. There are times, of course, when God does reveal himself in dramatic ways. The scriptures recount moments of burning bushes, parted seas, and dazzling visions. Yet these are the exceptions, not the norm. They serve to punctuate history, but they are not the ordinary rhythm of God's approach to human life. Most often, he comes softly, in whispers rather than roars, so that his people may learn to recognize him without reliance on spectacle. This is not a flaw but a gift, for if his presence were always overwhelming, we would lose the chance to choose, to cultivate eyes that see and ears that hear. By making himself subtle, God dignifies our freedom, allowing us to either open the door or leave it shut. Consider how often people overlook the sacred simply because it does not arrive in the package they expect. They long for visions and miracles, but dismiss the quiet nudge to forgive, the stirring to show kindness, the sudden awareness of beauty in the world around them. Yet it is in those very moments that God has drawn near. A sunrise flooding a room with light, a sudden stillness in the midst of chaos, a line of truth in a book that pierces the heart. These are the quiet fingerprints of a divine visitation. To those who are attuned, they are unmistakable. To those who are distracted, they pass by unseen. This means that the recognition of God's presence is not simply about waiting for him to act, but about cultivating within ourselves the sensitivity to notice when he already has. It is about training the heart to recognize his peace when it enters, his conviction when it whispers, his beauty when it shines through the ordinary. It is about refusing to reduce his activity to only the spectacular and learning instead to bow before the subtle. A true visitation of God transforms relationships, bringing reconciliation, peace, and generosity. A true visitation of God is never sterile, never confined to private sentiment alone, because his presence carries with it the power to transform relationships. It is impossible to welcome the eternal into a space without that presence pressing upon the ways in which people treat one another. Where human hearts have grown cold and walls of division have been built, his arrival begins to weaken the foundations of separation, and in their place something unexpected begins to grow: reconciliation, peace, and generosity. It is not the kind of transformation that comes about by human persuasion or clever arguments, but a deeper change, almost as if a new atmosphere has settled upon the household, altering the air itself and reshaping the hearts that breathe it. At the heart of reconciliation is the recognition that human beings, left to themselves, are not naturally inclined toward harmony. Pride, anger, resentment, and fear are powerful forces that twist even the closest bonds. Brothers turn away from one another, spouses become estranged, friends allow bitterness to take root, and families fracture under the weight of unspoken wounds. Without divine intervention, These divisions seem impossible to mend, for even when people attempt to reconcile by their own effort, the old injuries rise again to poison the attempt. Yet when God enters, something shifts at a level deeper than mere words. His presence illuminates the futility of clinging to anger, showing how small the injury looks against the vast backdrop of eternity. Suddenly, grudges that once felt immovable begin to loosen, and forgiveness which seemed beyond reach becomes thinkable. Imagine a home where two members have not spoken kindly in months. Conversations are reduced to cold necessities, smiles are absent, and the silence is heavy. Into such a household, when God draws near, there may not be a sudden dramatic reconciliation, but rather a softening. One heart feels a nudge to speak first, another feels the pride of self-justification begin to weaken. Perhaps it is a simple word, an apology half-formed but offered, or the courage to respond with gentleness instead of bitterness. These small beginnings are not human inventions. They are signs that a deeper power has entered the scene, working through the fragile willingness of human hearts. Reconciliation is not the product of willpower alone. It is the work of grace moving unseen, transforming hostility into peace. Peace, when God brings it, is more than the absence of conflict. It is not a fragile truce, waiting to collapse at the next provocation. Rather, it is a wholeness that binds together what was once torn apart. It seeps into the way words are spoken, into the way eyes meet without suspicion, into the way people dwell together without the constant tension of unspoken grievances. This peace is resilient, able to withstand the daily irritations and misunderstandings that would otherwise ignite quarrels, because it is anchored not in human agreement, but in divine presence. When God visits a home, He brings this peace as a gift, one that lingers even when circumstances would seem to demand conflict. Alongside reconciliation and peace arises another mark of God's visitation: generosity. For reconciliation that does not open the heart to others is incomplete. Where true divine presence is found, there is an overflowing beyond oneself, a willingness to give not only forgiveness, but also tangible expressions of love. A home touched by God ceases to be a fortress where resources are hoarded and time is guarded with suspicion. Instead, it becomes a place of welcome. Hospitality flows naturally, and even in scarcity, there is a desire to share. This generosity may take many forms: a meal offered to a neighbor, time given to listen to another's struggles, or resources shared with those in need. What matters is not the quantity of the gift, but the spirit that animates it, for that spirit reveals that the household has recognized the abundance of God's own giving and cannot help but reflect it. Generosity also transforms how members of a household treat one another. Where once there was competition for attention, resources, or recognition, there grows instead a spirit of mutual care. One begins to notice the needs of another, not as a burden, but as an opportunity. Acts of kindness emerge unprompted, and sacrifices once resented are offered with joy. Even small gestures, a shared smile, a cup of tea prepared without being asked, a word of encouragement, carry the weight of divine presence when they arise from hearts that have been reshaped by love. In such ways, the home becomes a reflection of the generosity of heaven, where giving is not a loss but a gain, and where the act of pouring oneself out becomes the very means by which hearts are filled. This transformation is not limited to relationships within the household. When God visits, the ripple extends outward, touching neighbors, friends, and even strangers. A family reconciled within itself becomes a beacon of peace to others, showing by example that forgiveness is possible and that divisions need not have the last word. The generosity that begins at the table spreads beyond the walls, feeding the hungry, comforting the lonely, and offering hope to the weary. In this way, a single household becomes a testimony, not because it has mastered perfection, but because it has allowed divine presence to reorder its relationships according to love. It is worth noting that such transformation often begins in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. There may not be a dramatic moment where reconciliation bursts forth fully formed, but rather a gradual unfolding, like the first light of dawn spreading across a darkened sky. The work of God in human relationships is often gentle, requiring patience and persistence. Yet the signs are unmistakable. Where once there was coldness, warmth begins to return. Where once there was indifference, care begins to grow. Where once there was suspicion, trust begins to take root. These are the marks of a household touched by God, the fruit of a visitation that cannot leave relationships unchanged. Joy in suffering is one of the clearest evidences that God has drawn near. Joy in suffering stands as one of the most mysterious and paradoxical signs of divine nearness. To the human mind, suffering and joy appear to belong to entirely separate realms, irreconcilable in their nature. Pain, loss, disappointment, and trial seem only to crush the spirit, while joy is thought to flourish in the absence of such burdens. Yet, when God draws near, something extraordinary occurs. Suffering, while still sharp and real, does not extinguish joy, but instead becomes the very place where it springs forth most powerfully. This is not a joy that ignores or denies pain, but a joy that coexists with it, growing like a resilient flower from soil cracked and dry. It is not natural, for nature resists pain and seeks escape, but it is supernatural, a gift planted deep within the soul by the hand of God Himself. When a household is touched by divine presence, the response to suffering is transformed. Imagine a family facing a season of hardship, a loss of income, an illness that weakens the body, a disappointment that threatens to overwhelm the heart. Ordinarily, such circumstances would drive spirits downward, producing despair, bitterness, or anger. Yet, with God near, even in the midst of grief, there appears an inexplicable undercurrent of hope. Tears may flow, but they are accompanied by a certainty that this darkness is not final. Pain may press heavily, yet there is an awareness that one greater walks alongside, bearing part of the weight. This awareness does not remove suffering but alters its texture, allowing joy to weave itself into the very fabric of grief. This joy is not loud or careless. It does not mock pain by pretending it does not exist. Instead, it is often quiet, steady, like a hidden fire that glows beneath the ashes of sorrow. It manifests in small but profound ways, in the ability to smile through tears, in the courage to continue loving when the heart feels broken, in the strength to give thanks even for the smallest mercies. Such expressions of joy are not products of positive thinking or human resilience. They are evidence of the divine presence that sustains the soul when all else seems to collapse. In this way, suffering becomes a kind of doorway through which one perceives the reality of God more vividly than in times of ease. The paradox of joy in suffering is most striking when observed over time. In the early stages of trial, the weight may feel unbearable, and the presence of God may be difficult to perceive. Yet as the days stretch on, as prayers are whispered in the silence and trust is tested in the fire, a transformation slowly occurs. What once seemed only bitter becomes seasoned with a sweetness that cannot be explained. Stories are filled with individuals who look back upon seasons of hardship and realize that those times, though painful, were also filled with a strange closeness to God that they had never known before. This closeness itself becomes the source of joy. The suffering was real, but the nearness of the divine within it was more real still, and that nearness left behind an indestructible gladness. Joy in suffering also carries within it a witness that extends beyond the household itself. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers observe the way a family endures hardship and cannot help but notice the difference. Where others might expect bitterness or despair, they see instead a quiet perseverance, a refusal to let sorrow define the entirety of existence. Such a testimony does not come from human strength, but from divine indwelling. It is in these moments that the world glimpses a reality beyond its own logic, a reality where joy does not depend on circumstance, but on the presence of God Himself. In this way, suffering, though unwanted, becomes the stage upon which the depth of God's sustaining power is displayed most clearly. There is also a transformative effect that suffering has upon relationships when accompanied by divine joy. Hardship can easily fracture households, creating tension, blame, and isolation. Yet when God is present, suffering often forges bonds instead of breaking them. Families find themselves drawing closer together, supporting one another with compassion, sharing burdens that once would have been borne in silence. Even the smallest acts of kindness take on profound significance when performed in the shadow of suffering. A hand held in silence, a prayer whispered at a bedside, a meal prepared for the weary. These acts, accompanied by divine joy, become sacred expressions of love that strengthen the bonds of the home. Furthermore, joy in suffering teaches a new way of seeing the world. It alters the values by which people measure their lives. What once seemed essential, comfort, ease, material security, fades into relative insignificance, while faith, love, and hope rise to their rightful place as treasures of lasting worth. This reordering of values is itself a form of liberation, for it frees the heart from slavery to circumstances. Those who know joy in suffering are no longer tossed helplessly by every wave of fortune or misfortune, because their anchor lies deeper than circumstance. Their joy is not rooted in what happens to them, but in the one who remains present through all things. In this way, suffering becomes a paradoxical teacher. Though it wounds, it also reveals. Though it strips away, it uncovers hidden strength. Though it breaks, it also builds. For in the midst of suffering, one learns the reality of divine companionship more profoundly than words could ever teach. And the joy that emerges from this companionship is not fragile. It is not like the shallow happiness that evaporates when trials come. It is instead a joy that endures, a joy that shines even in the valley of shadows, a joy that testifies to the unshakable reality of God's presence with His people.